words that we say every Sunday as the part of the service called the Creed. I've noticed that some of you seem to know the words by heart, while some just read the words off the page with no more emotion than you would if you were reading the eye chart at David Geisley's office. I believe in Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, our Lord. I've noticed that others of you remain silent for all or maybe just a certain part of the creed. And I'm guessing that if I were to stand back there behind you instead of up here in front, I would see some who maybe repeat the words with their fingers crossed behind their backs. And I have to admit I'd probably be in that last group, if truth be told, reciting the Apostles' Creed with my fingers crossed, at least during the parts that I'm not so sure about. Only about 20% of churches in America include reciting a creed as a part of their worship service. And according to our Lutheran worship book, it's optional. It's optional. I didn't know until this week that our brothers and sisters down the road and over the hill, the UCCs, the Congregationalists, they don't have any creeds. They are a non-creedal tradition, their bishop, in quotes, told me the other day over lunch. I had no idea. I thought all Christian churches had creeds. Churches founded before 1945 are far more likely to have a creed every Sunday in their service than ones that were founded after 1945. And researchers have discovered another interesting coincidence. If you're a church that recites the creed as a regular part of your worship, you are less likely to have electronic instruments in your worship music. And the more likely that you have electronic worship music instruments, the less likely you are to ever say a creed. So once again, Faith Lutheran Church breaks the mold and is the exception that makes the rule. One study revealed that 38% of lay people, the people in the pews or the red chairs, feel that reciting a creed during worship every week is very important. 38% of you think that. Only 14% of pastors do. Not only is that surprising because there's such a gulf between laity and clergy, but because it means a whopping 62% of parishioners don't feel the creed's important. And neither do 86% of their pastors. I was surprised at that. A clergy colleague of mine has a man in his congregation who's been coming to worship very regularly now for about a year. But he recently told the pastor that because they recite the creed every week that contains the phrase, born of the Virgin Mary, he cannot officially join their church. Enthusiastic as he is about his faith and about that particular community of believers, when he sees all the worshipers around him, these are his words, saying those 5 words without any qualms, you know, my clergy colleague and I were like, yeah, you want to bet? If you interviewed all of them, there are qualms. He just doesn't know it. But he says because he sees that, he can't commit in good conscience to becoming one of them. Now, does any of this surprise any of you? A little bit? No, yeah. Lorraine's like, no, I get it. And does any of it ring true for you? Have any of you struggled with one or more of the phrases in the creed we use? I know that for a few of you, our evening Bible study class has begun to kick up some of these issues. And I'm so sad that Lily isn't going to be here in September, October, because it's a question she asked me at the August Bible study that has led me to think about the sermon series on creeds of the church. I'll tell you more about what she said when we get to the Sunday that I talk about the Apostles' Creed. So if many lay people and a whole lot of pastors don't think reciting the creed is important, and if it's optional according to the Magic Lutheran Worship Book, and if it poses such a stumbling block to so many people, especially seekers and visitors, then why do we do it? And I'm really, actually, that's not a rhetorical question. I know as a new pastor that there are sacred cows hiding in the pages of the hymnal or underneath the carpet or in the weird colored curtains. Like, don't ever assume you know why something is the way it is at a church. So do any of you know, was there ever a debate? Was there ever a pastor who said we must have the creed every week? Or is there some story that I don't know?
The Lutheran Book of
red cursive writing, it says may. And so that's the magic word, right, in church world. Other parts will say, you will read this. The pastor will say that. And when it gets to the creed, it says, you may. So you can or you don't have to. But it is always there. And actually both are, the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. And either one on every setting of the Lutheran worship book. But you guys, there's no like secret story about Faith Lutheran that Pastor Jane, if you start messing with the creed, you're out of here. Okay, good.
We did have one time, I remember, when, I don't know why I remember, but everybody had to sit on that side. Somebody was gone, or something, and either Dave or Shelley or somebody talked about why we recite the creed. And then this connection that, that it's one of the very few things that we still share with the very earliest church, is this connection that's, I remember having that discussion at one point.
And we're going to have that discussion next week, in fact. I've already thought ahead. And yes, that's actually one of the really important things to know about the creeds. And yes, so good. So it's been talked about here before.
One more.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Sarah.
Maybe someone can help me remember, because I've bounced around in my church communities, but at one church that I was in, and it might have been this one, the pastor reminded us that you shouldn't necessarily face the cross or the altar overhead, because you're not saying it to God, you're saying it to each other.
Oh, that's
was that here that we all looked at each other and said the creed? Because it was like,
I like that.
or at least to not be in like a prayer. Like,
But it's about connecting.
For people that know it by heart, and then like they're in like a prayer mode, and it's like it's not a prayer, it's a stand and believe kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've not seen a lot of heads, so
Some other church.
some other church that's like a creed is not a prayer, it's
It's a statement of community, statement of belonging to each other.
I always look at the cross when I say it, and I'm glad that you said that. And it is a good point, because I always close my eyes and say it, think it's a prayer.
And I'm so busy crossing my fingers behind my back. Good to know. I like that. Whoever that pastor was, that's a really beautiful way to talk about it. Well, I think it's going to help us as a family of faith to spend some time this fall thinking about what the creeds say, about why we may or may not want to say them out loud together, starting with what the word creed means. It's from the Latin credo, which literally means I believe. I believe. The Gospels don't record that Jesus ever sat down and taught his disciples a creed. He taught them the Lord's Prayer. But he never said, now every time you all get together, I want you to say these words in this order. Some could argue, depending on what gospel that you're reading, that the first disciples, the first 12, did have a creed, and it was 3 words long, and it was Jesus is Lord, or Jesus is Messiah. That, depending, as I say, about which gospel you're reading, might have served as a creed. Jesus himself, as an observant Jew, would have had a creed, but it was the Shema. Hear, O Israel, our God is one God. The creed of monotheism is what made Israel distinct, and he was part of that community, so that would have been familiar to him as a creed. For the first followers of Jesus, and during the first centuries right after his death and resurrection, the earliest Christians don't seem to have had reciting creeds as a part of their practice. And they didn't use them to determine who was in and who was out, at least from what we can tell. I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. I wasn't there. But from the archaeological evidence and the documentary evidence, we haven't found any. You were considered a Christian if you followed Jesus' teaching, if you gathered with a community who also followed his teachings and broke bread in remembrance of the Last Supper, and if you were baptized. The truth of Jesus' teaching for them seems to have been confirmed simply by the fact that he was raised by the dead, and demonstrated to his disciples afterward that he was alive even though they had died. And each group of followers, and remember this is very early on, it's little tiny groups spread far apart from each other, they seem to have developed various opinions and understandings without needing to identify just one of them as correct. And if we look at Paul's letters, which are the very first things we have, right, those are the oldest things in the New Testament, if we look at what he says in letters to these little communities, the conflicts they were having were mostly about differences in social class. Like Lorraine read about, are you treating the rich people nicer than you treat the poor people in your church? Because if you are, that's a problem. Personality clashes. He talks a lot about like so-and-so who's really kind of a problem child and we need to deal with him. Or eventually the tension between Jews and Gentile converts. That's a lot of where the conflict was, but it wasn't about how many angels dance on the head of a pin, or was Jesus human, or was he divine. That came a little bit later. And we actually heard an echo of the Jew and Gentile tension in the story about Jesus. Did you notice that the woman he was arguing with was Gentile? And she's one of only 2 people to win an argument and get him to change his mind. Do you know who the other one was? His mama. So it's rare that that happened in any of the Gospels. It's her and his mom. That comes as no surprise to any of us who have had a mother. Then along came this guy named Constantine, right? The Roman emperor, who decided this new religion, this baby religion, Christianity, it was going to be the official state religion. He wanted to use that growing movement as a tool for expanding his empire way beyond Rome. So in 325, 300 years after Jesus walked the earth, Constantine called the bishops of the church together in one of his big mansions and said, the doors are locked and you're not getting out of here until you guys come together with a unified understanding of what the Christian faith is. I don't care what it takes, figure it out. I need a systematic statement of what Christianity is about. And the resulting statement that those bishops came up with has been the core of what we now call the Nicene Creed. Decisions about what would be in the creed, or we're told from official records, were made by the majority of bishops voting. So it was simple majority rule. We like this, we don't like that. If you were in the minority and you thought something should be in and no one else did, it wasn't going in. Later councils would kind of fine-tune and get more and more precise with wording for what would be considered correct belief. And for many, what this did was turn this living, fluid faith into intellectual battles over correct doctrine. Battles that would rage on and off for about the next 1,500 years. And let's be honest, still flare up, even today, 2,000 years later. Now, the Emperor Constantine, when you read about the creeds, he comes out looking like the villain. This big, bad emperor who, forced this, and it's all his fault. Or maybe the bishops get, slammed for being, for cooperating with that. But in fact, I think you could argue that where Christianity was in its development, when any movement is at that stage, sooner or later you've got to get some organization to the chaos or it's just going to fizzle out and die, right? So Constantine needs to expand his empire. Christianity's at a stage where they really need to codify some things, and they both were in the right place at the right time, and it was a match made in heaven. Or was it? In the coming weeks, I want us to spend some time exploring the historical background of each one of the creeds. What prompted them? Because always it was a fight. Always there was a fight. And so a council was formed and a creed got written to try to solve the fight. We're going to look at what those were and then think together about the benefits, because there are some, and David named one of the most important ones, and so did Sarah, and the costs of reciting creeds out loud in worship. And if you're open to it, along the way, I'd like to share with you some more contemporary creeds that have been written sort of in our day and time, to see what people today would put in that crystallization in just a few words of what the Christian faith means and is. Now, the Lutheran Church, by the way, just recognizes 3, Nicene, Apostles, and one called Athanasian, which I've never heard of, but we all know I'm a Presbyterian and need remedial Lutheran training. But when you read about it in books, there's always in parentheses, no one really uses that or even knows about it anymore. So I'll be fascinated to learn about the Athanasian Creed. Athanasian, I have no idea. Apparently it's about the Trinity, which then you understand, like, no wonder nobody talks about it, because nobody understands that. And we'll talk about those. And then I'm hoping some of you might be brave enough to try your hand at writing your own personal statement of faith or creed. And one way to do that is to use a resource written for churches by This I Believe. Has anyone ever heard of the radio thing called This I Believe? No? Okay. So back in the 1950s, there was a show hosted by Edward R. Murrow, which I'm assuming some people have heard about, and it was called This I Believe. And it was like a little public service announcement, short little 3-minute things that came on the radio. And in creating it, he said he sought to point to the common meeting ground of beliefs, which is the essence of brotherhood and the floor of our civilization. People talked like that back then. Each day, millions of Americans gathered by their radios to hear these essays that were written by people like Eleanor Roosevelt, Jackie Robinson, Helen Keller, Harry Truman, as well as corporate leaders, cab drivers, scientists, secretaries. Anyone able to distill into a few minutes the principles and core beliefs that guided their daily lives. Their words brought comfort and inspiration to a country that was worried about the Cold War, McCarthyism, and racial division. Now, in 2005 and 2009, the show was revived by NPR. And now it's a podcast, a series of books have been written collecting all these different essays. A middle and high school curriculum has been written to help students write their own. And in fact, Sophie in a class last spring at Orono, had an assignment from the This I Believe curriculum to write. As in the 1950s, this is a time when belief is dividing the nation and the world, says the NPR show's host Jay Allison. We are not listening well. We're not understanding each other. We're simply disagreeing or worse. Working in broadcast communication, there's a responsibility to change that, he says, to cross borders, to encourage some empathy. That possibility is what inspires me about this series. In reviving This I Believe, Allison and producer Dan Getteman said their goal was not to persuade Americans to agree on the same beliefs. Rather, they hoped to encourage people to begin the much more difficult task of developing respect for beliefs different than their own. In closing this morning, I thought it might be fitting to play the This I Believe essay written and read by an American hero whom we lost in recent days, Senator John McCain. I hope his words inspire you to feel the need for creed and to begin the process of thinking and writing your own personal statement of beliefs. So listen now with prayerful hearts to the words of John McCain.
When was this written?
2003, I think. No, it had to be after maybe 2006. And the bishop of the UCC is texting me right now. She's probably mad at me for saying they don't have creeds. Deborah. We were at Jay's Oyster House yesterday for lunch. I know, it was fun. Podcast, please.
Shouldn't she be preaching right now too?
She's up the street at Raven Village preaching.
Oh, she is?
She is.
Oh, okay.
All right, here we go. Where is it? Where is it? Right. Oh. Or she's showing me a picture of the bulletin with the creed in it. Who knows? All right. If needed, I can. If I hold my microphone up to this, will it cause feedback, or is that
Actually, should be all right.
August 25th. Senator John McCain died of cancer at the age of 82. Today we're going to listen back to a This I Believe segment we recorded with him back in October of 2005. It originally aired on NPR's All Things Considered and is introduced by independent producer Jay Allison.
Senator John McCain of Arizona is the son and grandson of Navy admirals. He graduated from Annapolis as a naval aviator and was shot down over North Vietnam and spent 5 years as a prisoner of war. It is one thing to hold beliefs, it is another to have them tested. Senator McCain's beliefs have undergone the scrutiny of public life and the harrowing personal trials of being a POW, and they've held up. The principles he lives by are the ones he's willing to die for.
I believe in honor, faith, and service to one's country and to mankind. It's a lesson I learned from my family, from the men with whom I served in Vietnam, and from my fellow Americans. Take William D. Rabnell. He was in Patton's tank corps that went across Europe. I knew him, though, as an English teacher and football coach in my high school. He could make Shakespeare come alive, and he had incredible leadership talents that made me idolize him. What he taught me more than anything else was to strictly adhere to our school's honor code. If we stuck to those standards of integrity and honor, then we could be proud of ourselves. we could serve causes greater than our own self-interest. Years later, I saw an example of honor in the most surprising of places. As a scared American prisoner of war in Vietnam, I was tied in torture ropes by my tormentors and left alone in an empty room to suffer through the night. Later in the evening, a guard I had never spoken to entered the room and silently loosened the ropes to relieve my suffering. Just before morning, that same guard came back and retightened the ropes before his less humanitarian comrades returned. He never said a word to me. Some months later, on a Christmas morning, as I stood alone in the prison courtyard, that same guard walked up to me and stood next to me for a few moments. Then with his sandal, the guard drew a cross in the dirt. We stood wordlessly there for a minute or two, venerating the cross, until the guard rubbed it out and walked away. To me, that was faith, a faith that unites and never divides, a faith that bridges unbridgeable gaps in humanity. It's the faith that we are all equal and endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a faith I would die to defend. My determination to act with honor and integrity impels me to work in service to my country. I believe that the means to real happiness and the true worth of a person is measured by how faithfully we serve a cause greater than our self-interest. In America, we celebrate the virtues of the quiet hero, the modest man who does his duty without complaint or expectation of praise, the man who listens closely for the call of his country, and when she calls, he answers without reservation, not for fame or reward, but for love. I have been an imperfect servant of my country, and my mistakes rightly humble me. I've tried to live by these principles of honor, faith, and service because I want my children to live by them as well. I hope to be a good example to them so that when their generation takes our place, they will make better decisions and continue to pave the path toward righteousness and freedom.
That was Arizona Senator John McCain